Hello and welcome to Ohio EPA's webinar addressing the Navigable Waters Protection Rule. My name is Mary McCarran and I'm hosting today's webinar. With me on the webinar is Tiffany Kavalak, Anna Kamyanev, and Joni Lung with Ohio EPA's Division of Surface Water, and Bill Fishbein with our legal office. In a moment, Tiffany will present, and I'd like to note that we are recording this webinar. At the end of the presentation, we'll hold a short question and answer session limited to clarifying questions about the information presented. We will pause after the presentation to allow questions to be typed in. Clarifying questions will be answered as time permits, and we will save all questions and comments submitted via the chat during the webinar. Before I turn things over, I have a couple of tips about the technical end of today's webinar. You should see a floating control panel on your computer screen. During the webcast, the sound may fade in and out due to your internet connection. If you experience problems with the sound during the event, either wait a moment or two to see if it's restored, or using the icon on the floating control panel, close or disconnect from the audio portion of the presentation, then reconnect to restore the audio. A couple of things before I turn it over. There are a couple of tips about the technical end of today's webinar. Again, please use the chat feature to report or receive assistance with technical issues. Please also use the chat feature to submit questions about the presentation. It is important for you to use the chat feature when asking the questions or submitting any comments. The Q&A feature only allows you to submit a limited amount of text due to a character limit, so remember to use the chat feature when you submit your questions or comments. When typing in questions, please set the audience to all panelists so that all of our panelists can see the questions as they come in. At this time, I'd like to hand this over to our Chief of Surface Water, Tiffany Kavalak.
Thank you, Mary. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We've invited multiple stakeholder groups to join us today: oil and gas industry, utilities, municipalities, counties, environmental groups, manufacturers association, Farm Bureau, etc. We have upwards of 500 registrants today, and we knew we would have a big crowd because this is quite a hot topic. Because we have such a big group, it's going to be very difficult for us to address all of your questions and concerns. That's why we're limiting the questions at the end just for clarifying questions. Most of you were invited to this webinar by an organization or trade group that you belong to. And if we don't get to your question today, I ask that you take those comments or questions that you have and send them back to the board members that invited you to this webinar, because we are holding individual meetings with the board members of all of the organizations and trade groups over the coming next 2 weeks. And hopefully we'll be able to address your comments through those individual calls. I have about 25 slides to go through, and this will be recorded, as Mary said, and it's going to be posted on our 401 website. You can go back and watch it again if you missed something, or you can send it to your colleagues that weren't able to see today. I do also want to say that we are working from home, so we apologize in advance if you hear dogs barking in the background. That is currently out of my control. So we'll get started. So for background, when the new Navigable Waters Protection Rule goes into effect, certain wetlands and streams that historically were regulated by US EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers will no longer be defined as waters of the United States. The rule will be effective 60 days after it was published in the Federal Register a couple of weeks ago. So it's going to be effective June 22nd, 2020. The federal change realigns US EPA's authority to protect navigable waterways and waterways that have a clear connection to navigable waters Navigable rivers, lakes, and streams remain under the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, along with wetlands and smaller streams that are directly adjacent or connected to navigable waters. With the change, the federal administration is clearly delineating which jurisdictional resources remain subject to federal oversight, while allowing states to decide on oversight of non-jurisdictional waters in ways that best protect their natural resources. So what does that mean for Ohio? When the federal law goes into effect, ephemeral streams, those that flow primarily during rainfall events, will no longer be subject to federal oversight under the Clean Water Act. This means that Ohio and many other states that have relied on federally delegated permitting authority to protect these resources can no longer issue permits under the authority of the Clean Water Act. And that for us is pretty much limited to the 401. The states can, however, use their own state authority to protect these resources. We have over 36,000 miles of ephemeral streams throughout Ohio. We do know that they help control runoff and erosion, they help reduce flooding potential, and they help filter pollutants. And isolated wetlands also have important functions in water management, nutrient retention, and supporting wildlife habitat. Ephemeral stream beds are located above the water table year-round. Runoff from rainfall is the primary source of water for stream flow. Here is a silt bed ephemeral stream, and this one has cobble and gravel. We are not sure if, the one on the right is the gravel. We are not sure yet if the Army Corps will want to make a jurisdictional determination first. That is a question that we still have to the Army Corps as to whether or not they're going to have to do a site visit and a jurisdictional determination before we can follow through on the state side of the house to permit. These are pictures of ephemeral streams also, and the only reason they have water in them is because these were after a significant precipitation event. They are typically dry unless there is a significant rainfall. There are certain features that we are not considering ephemeral streams, temporary channel-like features on the land surface created by water erosion that do not meet the definition of a tributary or are not a relocated tributary, including agricultural ditches, roadside ditches, and grass swale waterways. Here are some pictures of what we are discussing. Here's pictures of an agricultural ditch, roadside ditch, grass swale waterway. We do plan to continue to protect isolated wetlands under existing state isolated wetland permitting process. We're going to try to create an efficient permitting process to continue oversight of ephemeral stream impacts. And we are not proposing new regulations through rule or through law. Since 2001, Ohio EPA has had an isolated wetland permit program under state authority. This is 6111.02 through 6111.028. We will continue the isolated wetland permit program to protect these resources. We're also looking to using existing state permitting mechanisms to address ephemeral stream impacts. These permits could include additional conditions for an applicant to receive authorization for impacts to ephemeral streams. One concept would be that we could add an ephemeral stream authorization to our current construction stormwater general permit. We could issue a ephemeral stream authorization to a 401 water quality cert or to an isolated wetland permit. We would need a new authorizing mechanism to address impacts to ephemeral streams for projects on sites that are not otherwise covered under these types of permits. Here's just a flow chart of some options that we have been developing for permitting ephemeral streams. We discussed the construction stormwater general permit. We could add an ephemeral authorization to the construction general permit. A lot of large projects have to get a 404, and so they package their application with their intermittent, perennial, and ephemeral streams. So a lot of times we receive the same package application that's going to the 404 as a 401 application. We would then turn around and issue your 401 certification for your wetland impacts and your perennial and intermittent streams, and then add an ephemeral authorization to the back of that. Then we have the isolated wetland permit that we could issue with an ephemeral stream authorization on the back end. And then we've been working on the existing isolated wetland general permit, and we've added an ephemeral stream general permit in addition to the isolated wetlands permit to make up one general permit, so one application process. We'll talk about that a little more. So for ephemeral streams and permit terms and conditions and best management practices, for permits that have been issued by Ohio EPA under the Clean Water Act delegated authority, current requirements and best management practices for proposed ephemeral stream impacts include construction notification, minimization and avoidance of features where feasible, sediment and erosion control, using suitable fill materials, planting of native species, restoration activity, and mitigation for permanent impacts. These same conditions and best management practices would be attached to other state water permits referenced previously. The goal is to be protective of resources through efficient permit mechanisms for applicants. We are trying to build a way that if you're already coming in the door for something, let's attach an ephemeral authorization to whatever you're coming in for, so you don't have to apply for more than one permit if you don't want to. The general permit that we discussed as the new concept added to the isolated wetlands general permit, it does include thresholds for reporting and mitigation requirements to mimic the flexibility that is currently afforded in the nationwide permits for ephemeral stream impacts. And it also uses the 300 linear foot threshold for mitigation that is generally applied by the Huntington War District. Restoration and mitigation requirements for ephemeral streams would be the same as what has been required under permits for both temporary and permanent impacts. For temporary impacts, this includes performance goals such as achieving pre-impact contours, flow regime, and physical habitat score. It would also include some period of monitoring and reporting to ensure success of restoration and mitigation activities. For permanent impacts, current requirements include mitigation through purchase at a bank or in lieu fee program, or permittee responsible mitigation. We're also looking for the current mitigation ratios that are 1-to-1 for ephemeral streams with sand, silt, muck, clay, artificial dominant substrate, and then 1.5-to-1 for bedrock, the boulder, cobble, gravel, sand mix substrates. And again, these are the same pictures that we showed earlier, the streams with the 1-to-1 mitigation and the 1.5-to-1 mitigation. So our planned approach and our goals are to continue to protect isolated wetlands and ephemeral streams under state authority. We are not creating additional or new requirements. Requirements that have been in place to authorize impacts to these resources will be addressed through state permitting or authorization processes that will continue to be efficient for applicants. And our next steps and timeline, as I discussed at the beginning of the call, we are holding individual trade group stakeholder calls over the next 2 weeks, and those are getting scheduled. We are looking for input from the stakeholders as to whether a modification to our existing stormwater construction permit would be a viable tool for you to use as an ephemeral stream permitting mechanism. We have thought of many pros and cons of using this construction stormwater permit. We do know that if you had an ephemeral stream project that you needed to do mitigation for, you probably wouldn't want to use construction general permit for that because the mitigation review may slow down your issuance of your stormwater permit. You probably would want to keep those separate. There are also phasing timelines. You may not know what impacts you have to ephemeral streams in your ultimate construction, that you may want to start clearing activities with a construction permit. So we understand that it may not be a valuable tool in those situations, and the construction stormwater permit only kicks in if you are over 1 acre of area. And so we know there's a lot of small projects that happen that wouldn't even qualify for the construction stormwater permit, which is why we built the standalone general permit. Speaking of the standalone ephemeral stream general permit that's been added to the isolated wetland general permit, we do expect to public notice that draft tomorrow morning, sometime tomorrow, hopefully in the morning. That means that comments would be due through May 7th, and that would give us enough time to review the comments and develop a response to comments to try to have that tool available by June 22nd, 2020. And again, as we talked about the other tools of adding ephemeral stream authorizations to an isolated individual wetland permit or your typical water quality 401 permit that's a larger project, those will be able to be in place come June 22nd as we stand. So Mary, with that, I am done with my presentation. And I see that we've been getting a few comments coming in. One of the comments that I see is, will there be a way to get a certificate of attendance for continuing education hours? And I apologize, we did not get any of this pre-vetted through an operator cert or continuing ed. If that's something that you would like, we could provide you the material and you can try to get that on your own. So at this time, we will be taking some general comments and questions that you might have. And again, I do encourage you to soak in what we've said. We will post this webinar on our website so you can go back and listen to it. And then you'll have access to a general permit draft tomorrow so you can see the concept of that. And you may need both of those in context before you can absorb what we're trying to do and then formulate your questions and send those back up through your appropriate organization.
Okay, we have gotten some questions in via the chat. If not already addressed, what are Ohio EPA's highlights needed changes for biosolids land application and operations? Will intermittent streams not be included within a buffer zone?
Mary, I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. That's something we're going to have to probably take away and think about a little further.
Okay, it sounds like we're having some audio issues. Hold on a second, please. Continue typing in your questions.
Want me to try to?
Sure. Hold on.
A reminder to folks typing in their questions, if you can type your questions in and set the audience to all panelists, and you send them into the host privately, our speakers and panelists cannot see them. So as questions continue to come in, we'll pause for a couple minutes to let some more people type in their questions.
Mary, this is Bill Fishbein. Try to respond to the question about the biosolids. Okay,
thank you. Yes, thank you.
So today's discussion is principally focused on those who are needing to physically fill an ephemeral stream for purposes of a project, and that relative to biosolids really doesn't have any effect on that program. There's, for example, for relation distance, waters of the state.
Hey, Bill, your audio is going in and out right now. So can you repeat the last part of your answer?
So there's nothing that we're proposing here today that would affect requirements relative to the biosolids program. So, for example, if there is distance from waters of the state, there's nothing that we're
Thanks, Bill. We are getting some questions in.
I think we can go through some of these, Mary, now that we can see them.
I just wanted to remind people again to send it to all panelists versus privately to a host to get their questions in.
So I see one question that says, what do we expect the monitoring period to be on ephemeral streams for permitted lead mitigation projects? And I think that we have put a monitoring time frame in the general permit for those that come through that portal. So you'll see, take a look at that draft tomorrow, and then let us know if you have additional questions. Bill, can you go into Teams and look at a couple of these questions that are legal in nature? I do also see a question, will mitigation banks still generate credits for ephemeral stream restoration? Yes. We do still expect banks to be a viable option for folks that want to cash their mitigation requirements. I also see a question that says, is there a plan to incorporate changes into the oil and gas construction stormwater permit as well, or just the normal construction stormwater general permit? And I think that's a question for stakeholders, is using both construction stormwater permits a vehicle that you would like to use to get your ephemeral stream authorization, or are the other tools that we've already discussed today and the new general permit that we post tomorrow, does that give you enough flexibility to do what you need to do?
One of the other questions has, and now they just jumped on me. There was a question about if the construction general permit is going to be revised to include ephemeral stream, who will review and approve? Will the local MS4s be involved in that, or the regional offices? Those are all good questions. Those certainly, especially the MS4 question, has been raised as a potential concern. So that's it. To the extent that you have thoughts or comments on that particular aspect of things, we would definitely feedback on that. There's another question about who will make the determination of whether a stream is ephemeral or intermittent. Again, that, as Tiffany alluded to, that's sort of an open question that we're trying to get clarification from the Corps, whether or not they are going to for that based on state's perspective, or whether they are going to do, jurisdictional determinations as they have historically done. That's an open question. There's a question of whether or not Ohio is one of the 17 states sued regarding the new rule. We have not.
Bill, we may have lost your audio again.
Hear me now?
Yes,
You're you're echoing, so I'm wondering if you have your Teams microphone on.
Okay, how about that? Guys hear me now?
Yes, that's a lot better. So again, this is not your only opportunity to ask questions. Take a look at the public notice. We will send that link back to the organizations that invited you to this webinar. And if you are not part of an organization that you were invited to the webinar, we can also send the link to the email address of those of you who registered for this webinar. And then definitely be working with your organizations to develop Q&A that you would like to discuss with us directly when we have the smaller stakeholder meetings. Mary, are you getting any additional questions?
There are a few. Who will make the determination whether a stream is ephemeral or intermittent?
Bill's already talked about that one.
Oh, sorry. I'm trying to.
Okay.
That may have been when I was cutting out, but the answer is it's still a bit unclear whether or not the Corps is intending whether that will be deferred to the state.
Okay, and again, this is an expansion on that question is what about streams that are flowing, then ephemeral, and then flowing again? I imagine the answer is the same from you, Bill.
Right, whether something is intermittent or ephemeral, again, the question of when we make that final call is something that we...
All right, unfortunately, it sounds like Bill's audio is not great for the WebEx connection. I'm getting some comments in that people cannot hear to fully understand the answers. So I apologize for that again. Like Tiffany said, we're all working from home. So sometimes depending on our either cellular connection or internet access, things can get a little glitchy. So I apologize for that. Some people have also asked if the presentation will be able to be reviewed later. The PowerPoint presentation. We are recording this.
Yes, we are recording this as we speak, and we will try to get this posted on our 401 website by tomorrow. And when we send out the link to the public notice of the general permit, hopefully we'll have a web link that we can also include back to this webinar if we're able to make technology happen that quickly.
Okay, at this time, I understand there are some questions that have come in. If we have not been able to answer those questions, or if you have additional questions, like Tiffany said earlier, please talk with your associations and submit questions via that route. We had a couple hundred folks on this webinar, so I apologize again for any audio issues that you might have had or technical glitches that we might have had. But again, we are recording it and we will make that available to those who have registered for this event. Tiffany, did you have anything to say to close it out?
I do not. I just want to thank everybody for taking the time to listen today. We don't have all of the answers, but we just certainly want to have permitting mechanism options for the applicants when June 22nd comes around. And we spoke earlier today internally that, it's possible that those 17 states that did sue are able to get some type of stay, which means we would go back to the way things are today. Or the new rule may be in effect without a stay, and we need to make sure that we have permitting options available so that folks aren't coming in conflict with our 6111 waters of the state rules and law. So thank you, everyone, and I look forward to having more pointed conversations and detailed conversations. I know you guys are certainly going to want to dive into more technical details, and we can do that in a smaller setting. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.